In December of 1994, the LA Times would write a retrospective report marking a decade since the start of the crack epidemic in the city. If there was an eye to the storm, if there was a criminal mastermind behind crack's decade-long reign, if there was one outlaw capitalist most responsible for flooding Los Angeles' streets with mass-marketed cocaine, his name was Freeway Rick. At his peak, Ricky Donnell Ross, also known as Freeway Rick, was operating an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a sprawling network which employed thousands and distributed cocaine to cities in every corner of the country. At his home base in South Los Angeles, Rick Ross was moving upwards of 150 kilos of cocaine a week, enough to put 3 million doses of crack in LA streets every 7 days. On any given week, Ross was raking in millions of dollars, sometimes even on a good day.
Maybe $1 million a day, $2 million a day sometimes.
Our problem became counting the money. Man, my fingers hurt. We got to the point where it was like, man, we don't want to count any more money. So Ross employed people to do just that. Count money using money counter machines, which operated day and night. Ross maintained properties which stored not drugs or weapons, but cash. Aside from his counting houses, Ross also maintained cooking houses for processing powder cocaine and refining it into crack, or what he and his lieutenant Ollie Biglobe Newell called Ready Rock. Free-base cocaine smoking had existed as far back as the mid-1970s. A head shop pamphlet published in 1976 called The Pleasures of Cocaine describes in detail multiple recipes for stripping away impurities in powder cocaine and purifying it into cocaine freebase, which is essentially the process of freeing the alkaloid from the salt in cocaine hydrochloride, or street cocaine. The end result is a waxy, volatile substance which disappears into vapor when heated. This route of administration, which enters the lungs and subsequently the bloodstream and brain, produces an extremely powerful high. Processing powder cocaine into freebase became a clever marketing maneuver for cocaine dealers in South Los Angeles. The dirt cheap prices for single units, which could be as low as $10, created an unavoidable mass marketing explosion. Crack saw its early rise in the early 1980s, but wouldn't become widely available across the nation until 1986. The next year, in 1987, more than 5% of American high school seniors had smoked crack. To feed this demand, Ricky Ross moved to industrialize the trade. I had as many as 5 cookhouses, because that was our hardest thing, to cook. Once you cooked it, it was sold. To outfit a cookhouse, the interior was gutted, windows barred and steel doors installed. Restaurant-sized gas stoves would be wheeled in, with giant aluminum stockpots bubbling round the clock cooking crack. Upon visiting one of Ross's cookhouses, notorious drug dealer Leroy Chico Brown marveled at what he saw. They were stirring these big pots with those things you use in canoes, oars. Rick Ross, despite his larger-than-life legacy, is not a household name. Certainly not as much as his namesake, Maybach Music's Rick Ross. The reason may very well be that delving into Ross's story is a deeply unpopular thing for mainstream outlets to do. One journalist out of Sacramento, California, would find this out the hard way and pay dearly for it. The story is somewhat well known. Gary Webb, a reporter for the San Jose Mercury News, released a series of articles over 3 days which documented Ricky Ross's rise, as well as his connections to the Nicaraguan Contras, a right-wing CIA-backed guerrilla army who sought to overthrow the leftist Sandinista government, who had wrested power from the US-backed Somoza dictatorship in 1979. The series exploded, and is credited as being among the first, if not the first, viral news story of its size, and pioneered many aspects of online reporting still used today, such as hyperlinking to images of documents and even audio files of wiretap recordings and court testimony. The series was almost certainly the #1 news story of 1996, as the uproar sparked by the article was so inconceivably great. The story launched an intense wave of furor, namely among Black Americans, who were outraged at the prospect of government complicity if not outright collusion, with architects of the crack epidemic, which had devastated their community so mercilessly. The series' choice of graphics and headlines, along with their provocative wording, also sparked an uproar, or, more accurately, a concerted effort to sink not only the story, but Gary Webb's reputation and livelihood. For the better part of a decade, the series began. A San Francisco Bay Area drug ring sold tons of cocaine to the Crips and Bloods street gangs of Los Angeles and funneled millions in drug profits to a Latin American guerrilla army run by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. This drug network opened the first pipeline between Colombia's cocaine cartels and the black neighborhoods of Los Angeles, a city now known as the crack capital of the world. The cocaine that flooded in helped spark a crack explosion in urban America. Spicy, provocative, as editors and publishers tend to be, but were his assertions wildly off the mark or wrong? The series made its case by investigating Ricky Ross's suppliers, who were in fact a pair of Nicaraguans, both former members of the Somoza dictatorship, the chief source of recruits for the so-called Contras.
I was getting my coke from a guy by the name of Oscar Danilo Blandon, who also was my informant. He's the guy that set me up with the police. When I went to trial, we found out that he was what they call a Contra. The Contras was backed by the CIA, and it sparked this big investigation by this reporter called Gary Webb.
What isn't debated is that Oscar Danilo Blandon and his supplier, Norwin Meneses, met with the Contras military commander Enrique Bermudez in Nicaragua in 1982. According to Blandon, Bermudez told him to raise money for the Contras by any means necessary.
There is a saying that the end justifies the means.
And that's Mr. Bermudez told us in Honduras, okay? So we start raising money to the Contra-Revolution.
And though Blandon said that drugs weren't mentioned, reporter Gary Webb suggested that the mere presence of Norwin Meneses strongly underscored their intentions, given that Meneses was reportedly referred to in Nicaraguan newspapers as the king of drugs. Of course, Bermudez, who was on the CIA's payroll from 1980 to 1991, himself had a hand in the drug trade. A CIA cable to headquarters reported how Bermudez's organization, the Legion of September 15th, had made a decision to engage in drug smuggling into the United States in order to finance its anti-Sandinista operations. Norwin Meneses, who was, again, a notorious trafficker, reportedly met with other members of the Contra leadership a number of times. Another element which piqued Gary Webb's suspicions and formed another key component of the story was the fact that numerous investigations into the Meneses organization went nowhere. When the article was published, Norwin Meneses had not spent a single day in a U.S. prison, which was notable, Webb suggested, because as far back as 1974, the U.S. government knew that he was a cocaine trafficker. In fact, in 1978, the FBI reported that Norwin and his brother Ernest were, quote, smuggling 20 kilos of cocaine at a time into the United States. That same year, the DEA's El Paso office issued a 365-day lookout for Meneses, stating that, quote, info from DEA indicates that subjects may smuggle cocaine into the U.S. Despite this, in 1982, Meneses was admitted on a B-1 business visa to the United States, which was further extended until November 1983. Blandon led an equally charmed life. For at least 5 years, he brokered massive amounts of cocaine to the black gangs of Los Angeles without being arrested. But his luck changed overnight. In 1986, Blandon was actually the target of a search warrant carried out by the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. But despite raiding more than a dozen locations, officers turned up nothing, as each location was completely cleaned out of drugs and weapons.
Everybody's waiting for the crew that's going to come in and say, hey, we got 100 kilos. Everybody shows up empty-handed. Same story from everybody else is that we got burned. Somebody burned us.
The Sheriff's Department suspected foul play, and according to Los Angeles Federal Public Defender Barbara O'Connor, the cops always believed that investigation had been compromised by the CIA. The author of the search warrant affidavit, Sergeant Tom Gordon, would outline many of the same facts that Webb would report years later. Danilo Blandon is in charge of a sophisticated cocaine smuggling and distribution organization operating in Southern California. the monies gained from the sales of cocaine are filtered to the Contra rebels to buy arms in the war in Nicaragua. In September of 2014, the CIA released a trove of documents spanning decades, among them being an article from the CIA's own Studies in Intelligence journal titled Managing a Nightmare. The piece reflected on the weeks following the Mercury News series debut, which became a major public relations crisis. The charges could hardly be worse. A widely read newspaper series leads many Americans to believe CIA is guilty of at least complicity, if not conspiracy, in the outbreak of crack cocaine in America's inner cities. But luckily for CIA, they wouldn't have to put out their own fire. A ground base of already productive relations with journalists and an effective response by the Director of Central Intelligence's Public Affairs staff helped prevent the story from becoming an unmitigated disaster. Of course, the paper is referring to the onslaught of criticism leveled at the Mercury News, which is well documented. The three major blows came in short succession, from the Washington Post, the New York Times, and then the Los Angeles Times. That third week in September was a turning point in media coverage of the story. Most press coverage included, as a routine matter, the now widespread criticism of the Mercury News allegation. The Washington Post began by attacking the paper's notion that Nicaraguans played any significant role in the trafficking of cocaine, citing, quote, widely accepted evidence from government reports and academic studies. The Post also downplayed Meneses and Blandon's CIA connections to the Contras, as well as the amount of money they sent to the Contras and the amount of cocaine they sold. The article was written by Roberto Suro and Walter Pincus, and, as Webb would later uncover, the latter had a history with the CIA. Employed as a propagandist, Walter Pincus had written an article for the Post in 1967 titled How I Traveled Abroad on CIA Subsidy, where he describes smuggling anti-communist literature into foreign countries at the behest of the agency. The New York Times followed suit and zeroed in on the alleged CIA connections of Meneses and Blandon. Neither of them, government officials say, worked for or had any discernible direct contact with agents of the CIA. The Times would release another article, again attacking CIA connection allegations, citing more unnamed sources, or, as the New York Times put them, current and former intelligence and law enforcement officials, former rebel leaders, and Contra supporters. To their credit, the paper did include an admission from Contra leader Adolfo Calero, who confirmed that the meeting between Blandon, Meneses, and the Contra military commander Enrique Bermudez did indeed take place. But, the paper said, although Mr. Bermudez, like other Contra leaders, was often paid by the CIA, he was not a CIA agent. The biggest doozy for Webb probably came from the 3-day series from the Los Angeles Times, the flagship paper of the city which Webb called the crack capital of the world. The first article, written by a Jesse Katz, began with the following. The crack epidemic in Los Angeles followed no blueprint or master plan. It was not orchestrated by the Contras or the CIA or any single drug ring. Katz concluded that no millions of dollars were sent to the Contras, but just a mere $50,000, citing an unnamed, quote, Contra supporter and a business partner who sold drugs with Blandon. Katz also included a bizarre quote from former Cleveland Browns fullback Jim Brown, in what I could only conceive to be an attempt to pander. Jim Brown, the former NFL Hall of Famer, has seen this whole story unfold from a ringside seat. People are still hungry, Brown said, and all this CIA Contra stuff isn't going to feed them. Katz enlightens us that, quote, Brown insists that neither the CIA nor the Contras have much relevance to the crack trade. Well, the jury's in, guys, and thanks for that, Jim Brown. Katz also took issue with the focus on Ricky Ross's drug dealing, which he insisted was overblown in Webb's story. Although Ross was a dominant figure, he still had to jostle with the likes of Thomas Tootie Reese, L. Raider Ray Browning, and the Bryant family, all drug lords who came on the scene either before Ross or at the same time. Thankfully, Gary Webb would comment on that exact list of drug dealers later, clarifying for us that Tootie Reese was arrested by the DEA in 1983, L. Raider Browning was in jail from 1982 to 1985 during the crack epidemic's onset in LA, and the Bryant family had never sold crack in South Central, and was, according to an earlier LA Times story, quote, too small for the department's major violators narcotics unit to bother with. It's also curious that Katz would go to such lengths to downplay Rick Ross's impact, since just 2 years prior he had written a retrospective article about him. Remember this quote from the beginning of the video? "If there was one eye to the storm, if there was a criminal mastermind behind Crack's decade-long reign, if there was one outlaw capitalist most responsible for flooding Los Angeles' streets with mass-marketed cocaine, his name was Freeway Rick." Indeed, a law enforcement source, who Webb actually names, puts Ross's power in no uncertain terms. Citing Edgar and Jacinto Torres, two major cocaine traffickers affiliated with Danilo Blandon, Bell police officer Jerry Guzetta compiled a report he titled Operation Sahara. The Torres brothers were his confidential informants at the time, and provided intelligence on Rick Ross's cocaine empire. Basically, there is one major market, which for the sake of argument in this report will be designated the black market, because it is solely controlled by two black males by the name of Rick and Ollie. A follow-up LA Times piece, this time written by Doyle McManus, concedes that from the CIA's inception to the secret war in Laos, the agency's operatives sometimes winked at drug smuggling by local forces they were using in the Cold War struggle with communism. But as the plague of narcotics became a greater concern at home, the agency tightened policies requiring its personnel to report all serious crimes. Though McManus is obviously critical of Webb, he actually does his article a service by introducing two new members of the Meneses drug ring who Webb hadn't even mentioned in his article, Jairo Meneses and Renato Pena. And though the alleged Contra connections of Blandon and Meneses were so heavily criticized, Renato Pena was a full-fledged Contra, serving as their press secretary in California. He ended up being busted for cocaine trafficking. The articles, as damaging as they were to the Mercury News, did little to fan the flames of outrage. Protests erupted in LA and even the CIA headquarters at Langley. In an insane, unprecedented move, Bill Clinton sent the director of the CIA, John Deutsch, to a town hall in Watts, in front of a crowd of furious South Central Los Angeles residents. Political pressure, channeled namely by the Congressional Black Caucus, led by LA's very own Maxine Waters, sparked investigations. The Justice Department, as well as the CIA's Inspector General, would launch their own investigations, and would publish their heavily redacted conclusions in 1998. Though the reports, not surprisingly, criticized the series, they contained some shocking admissions that by all means strengthened Webb's arguments. The Justice Department picked up where the LA Times left off, tracking down Renato Pena, the Contra official who had been busted for drug trafficking. According to the Justice Department, when debriefed by the DEA in the early 1980s, Pena said that the CIA was allowing the Contras to fly drugs into the United States, sell them, and keep the proceeds. Pena further stated in 1997 that Jairo Meneses told him the United States was aware of these dealings. Furthermore, Pena said Blandon and Norwin Meneses told him they were raising money for the Contras through drug dealing, and that, quote, the Contras would not have been able to operate without drug proceeds. Further, Norwin Meneses told Pena that Contra leader Enrique Bermudez was aware of the drug dealing as well, and that Bermudez was indeed a CIA agent. It's very obvious. They actually weren't done there, and cited a DEA interview with an informant called SR3, who was considered, quote, extremely reliable. The informant told the DEA that Norwin Meneses had been a member of the FDN, the largest Contra army, and had been trafficking both to make money for himself and to raise funds for the Contras. The informant also said that Renato Pena was one of the major Contra fundraisers in San Francisco and was one of those responsible for sending Meneses' drug proceeds to the Contras. In the CIA report, Inspector General Frederick Hitz stated, "Let me be frank. There are instances where CIA did not, in an expeditious or consistent fashion, cut off relationships with individuals supporting the Contra program who were alleged to have engaged in drug trafficking." The report also revealed that from 1982 all the way to 1995, the CIA and Justice Department secretly concluded a Memorandum of Understanding regarding the reporting of federal crimes. Though a previous list of federal crimes contained narcotics trafficking, this one explicitly did not, causing some concern from the Attorney General, but nevertheless, the list remained unchanged. And by abstracting the definition of a non-employee of the CIA to mean assets, pilots who ferried supplies to the Contras, as well as Contra officials and others, the reporting guidelines by definition did not apply to them. When this secret memo was exposed to the public, civil rights lawyers from LA and Oakland actually sued the CIA and Justice Department. According to the second volume of the report, the New York Times reported, the CIA knew from the very beginning. As a small group of rebels was being formed from former soldiers of the National Guard of the deposed Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza, a CIA informant reported that the leadership of the fledgling group had decided to smuggle drugs to the United States to support its operations. The backlash at Gary Webb, another dark alliance, this time between the CIA and mass media, proved to be insurmountable. The volume of articles from the Washington Post, the New York Times, and LA Times, which combined totaled over 30,000 words, overwhelmed the Mercury News staff and ultimately sank the story. Their chief editor, Jerry Seppos, would publish what amounted to a recantation of Dark Alliance, writing, "We fell short of my standards for the Mercury News." To illustrate just how difficult this story is to sort out, I should tell you that reporter Gary Webb, who wrote the series, disagrees with my conclusions. Gary believes the evidence isn't gray. He sees the issues in much clearer terms than I do. Webb would later describe the tense meeting where they unveiled to him that they were running the letter. Let me get this straight. We're killing the other stories, we're not going to do any more investigation of this topic, and we're going to run this mealy-mouthed column that pretends we don't know anything else, tuck our tails between our legs, and slink off into the sunset? That's what you've got in mind?
It was essentially a war between my editors and myself because I wouldn't apologize for the story or back away from the story, and fought them on it publicly. And so they transferred me to a bureau that was 140 miles from where I lived, and I called in sick a lot.
On November 19th, 1997, the Mercury News agreed to settle an arbitration with Webb. 19 years after becoming a reporter, I quit the newspaper business. When this story first fell on Gary Webb's lap, in the form of a mysterious note left on his desk, he went to work finding contacts, and stumbled on FBI interviews with a Dennis Ainsworth, a Contra supporter in San Francisco. He managed to track him down, and had with him what Webb described as a disconcerting conversation. "I almost got killed. I had friends in Central America who were killed. There was a Mexican reporter who was looking into one end of this, and he wound up dead. So don't pretend that you know. You have no idea what you're touching on here, Gary. No idea at all." I need your help. This channel relies on donations and patrons. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video or you feel like you learned something, please consider subscribing. And if you want to support the channel further, just go to patreon.com/GDFofficial to become a patron. The link is in the description. There you can watch exclusive and completely uncensored videos and join the many Discord servers, where everyone is really cool and we talk about video ideas all the time. It's a really great community there. I also accept donations via PayPal and Cash App. Those QR codes are on the screen now. Also, those links are in the description as well. I'd really appreciate any donation since YouTube hardly monetizes my videos, and it all goes to supporting the channel and making better quality content and helping with my research. Well, that's all for today, and again, I really appreciate you guys watching. Stay tuned for future videos. Love you all, and take care.